So, hi everyone. I'm here with Andy Pritchard today. So, Andy, you're the Chief Strategy Officer for Telrock. I know we go back a fair way, but it's great to have you join me for a quick discussion, really.
Thank you very much.
So you've got a huge amount of experience in the collections technology space. Given how long you've been within that, I mean, how have you sort of see that change over the last few years? Because it feels like we've been on a real journey in terms of the speed of change. What's been your experience with that?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I spent nearly 25 years in the collections technology space, which wasn't at the start of kind of enterprise technology in the collections and recoveries area, but it wasn't far off the start. Back when I started, it was all AS400, IBM mainframe technology, green screen interfaces for agents, very heavy batch running systems, and then moving into kind of Windows technology and then web technology. But actually, a lot of that was the same technology underlying all of those systems. And it was quite a slow period of change.
Mm,
Collections was always quite a follower, not a leader for obvious reasons. Collections will only ever be a percentage of originations and so on.
exactly.
And so it was quite a slow change and kind of evolution of technology over those years. And then post global financial crash, 2008, 9, 10, uh, what was quite a limited market space really for collections technology started to become a lot more crowded. And you're right that the pace of change really started picking up in everything from the platforms that the technology is sitting on through to consumer communication channels and so on. And it seems to just be getting faster and faster.
What do you think the driver of that was? Do you think it was new technology coming through, or do you think it was the economics that kind of changed? Because usually, whenever there's some sort of economic crash, usually you can find money to fix an issue, right? So there's usually investment around. But there's also been this fundamental change in just accessibility of data and processing power as well. I mean, what do you think has really driven that sort of flip to a certain extent?
You're absolutely right. I mean, post global financial crash, collections and recoveries went from an administrative function and a rounding error on the balance
Mm,
sheets to being a make or break for an organization, and the path to the C-suite became a lot shorter. So I think that certainly it certainly had an impact. But you're absolutely right. The technology changes as well enabled the adoption of enterprise level software became more accessible, right?
mm.
And we were able to start building these types of technologies a lot quicker. And I think a whole bunch of folk just adjusted their focus from whether that was from marketing into collections because the need was there, whereas it wasn't previously.
Yeah. And I suppose if you look at just like the here and now, what do you think is like some of the hot topics that you're hearing people being sort of focused on now? And so like, what are the big developments that are going on now? So you've got AI in the background to a certain extent, but there'll be other stuff that's going on as well. I mean, what are you hearing has been the hot topics that people are asking about?
Yeah, so I think there's been quite a few over the last few years. I mean, definitely cloud technology. And I talked about the evolution of green screen, web, and true cloud technology. Whilst it's perhaps slightly less glamorous than some of the
Mm,
AI conversations, it really genuinely has the power to make a significant difference because organizations that were fortunate enough to build their technology in the cloud really can harness all of the power of the cloud today and tomorrow straight within their product suite. And so, I remember sitting with some large banking clients in 2015, 2016, saying that the cloud and certainly public cloud would never be something that they would consider 2, 3, 4 years later. That's where they're all spending their money on software. So cloud technology and kind of true native cloud products is certainly a big development and a big game changer. Of course, there are some other areas as well. One that's interesting to me at the moment around the sort of the omni-channel approach. And I think that's an area that's changed. Omni-channel is not new, but there are tools now that can help you build your omni-channel capability much more harmoniously. It used to be a real kind of spider's web of integration, and now it can be relatively easy. I think when you look at things like RCS messaging has really got the opportunity to be a bit of a game changer as well in terms of customer communication. And of course, AI is the topic that everyone is talking about as well.
Now, it's interesting when you say cloud and you sort of like juxtapose that next to AI, which is almost like you have this. I mean, it's like the hype cycle, isn't it? I mean, I remember when cloud was, and we were all talking about cloud. We used to have conferences on cloud, and it felt like it wasn't until really sort of like 4 or 5 years later. I mean, now you never hear do you want to have that on-prem or do you want to have that in the cloud? I mean, it's like it sort of becomes like really rarely hear that versus like I don't know 5 years ago or 10 years ago. That was actual active discussion. But how much do you think we get sort of sidetracked by the hype and the ideas versus the reality takes sort of like 5 years to sort of catch up, and now it's ubiquitous, right?
Yeah, completely. I think that's very true. I mean, in terms of cloud, there is also a bit of divergence from organizations that have repurposed their technology into the cloud. So it's cloud available versus those that are inherently built in the cloud. And those that are inherently built and born in the cloud really are able to take advantage of all of the scalability, flexibility, security, resilience, and other tools as well. So, for example, we have recently partnered with AWS, available in any other cloud native infrastructure as well. But the beauty of partnering with someone like AWS is as they start to innovate and to develop, you've got all of these tools that are at your disposal. They innovate and provide more technology. You're able to utilize that. And I think not just in terms of the speed of change now for technology, but also the speed of being able to adopt that new technology as well. Going back a decade, 15 years, it was really difficult to take advantage of any new technology. Those older infrastructures just did not enable you to utilize any of the new sort of bells and whistles that were coming along. And now it's a lot easier. You're talking about business analysts being able to configure and play with technology and implement in weeks and months versus years.
Yeah, I mean, legacy systems. When you talk about green screens, I've still seen green screens around occasionally, right? And as much as I might like them, being an old person, like the technology's moved on since then. We now have
Yes.
fax machines and those sorts of things, right? But I mean, how much of an issue is that sort of legacy technology being able to migrate that? But then also, then what's the opportunity with new technologies? 'Cause I think you guys have built completely new stack. You're on new technology, those kind of things. What's the opportunity, and what are some of the complexities in terms of making that move?
Yeah. So I think there's always an element of good fortune in business as well as foresight. And the team at Telrock built the Optimus product at a time where they were able to build it directly in the cloud. So it's taking advantage of all modern technology and modern software practices. It means that the adoption of that is significantly quicker. I mean, one of the big problems that has been in our industry for a long time is just the length of time to implement, to upgrade, to change your technology. You're absolutely right. And some of that is on the client side, where you take an organization which on the surface has a single logo, but when you get down to their technology, there's maybe 100 years of mergers and acquisitions underneath it that makes it more complicated. Um, and a lot of organizations, a lot of vendors have really struggled over the years, over the last 20, 30 years, to try and speed that up. I mean, you're talking about some very complicated software, some very generic software. I mean, at Telrock, we're a global business, so it's not just about selling into a single territory. It's about having something that's relevant for Brazil as much as it is the US, the UK, and Vietnam as well, for example. So it's about ensuring that you've got the ability to service a whole raft of feature functionality, but at the same time trying to make the adoption of that and the building of that as quick as possible. And the reality is you have to go through a number of phases, right? So you have to design what you want. You need to configure that, and then you need to test it, and then you can go live. And that hasn't changed in 40 years. But what we have done, and I've obviously over the last few months got to know our product even better than I did before, is how you can fast track those elements, right? So, in terms of the big changes that you've talked about in the last few years, the introduction of kind of low code, no code is huge. So the ability to be able to create workflow strategies with a user interface, almost create like a Visio document, press a button, the configuration is already done. The ability to get data in and out, we used to have rafts of IT teams, and the IT department is always stretched and was always a bottleneck. And you're able to build these now in minutes with API functionality. And so some of that stuff, again, is less glamorous, but actually it gets you to your ROI quicker. It enables you to get your platform up and running. You're not dual paying for technology quicker. And then you're able to kind of get on with the more glamorous side of things.
Do you think having it configured in the way you've got it, particularly with sort of, remotely or on central servers, do you think that's going to get around this sort of legacy issue in the future? Are we going to be able to sidestep it, or do you think we're still going to have issues with that? Is this a one time, one and done? Let's move off what we had, and now we're onto something new.
And if you're asking someone in the sales team or someone in the delivery team, but the days of year-long, multi-year upgrades should be over for organizations that are, are built a good product line and then upgrading. So the updates in a SaaS model should be coming through incrementally and delivered fairly silently with kind of minimal testing. And so it should be the case that the multi-year programs are over until an organization wants to change.
Yeah. I mean, whenever you change technology or you change with an upgrade, there's going to be a headache involved. It just means for the client at the end of the day, it's not their headache, it's actually the vendor's headache. And,
Right.
they kind of know what they're doing, right? So it moves where the work takes place to a certain extent.
It certainly does. And I actually think that taps onto an interesting point, which is, organizations that are delivering software as a service. These are
Mm.
typically software engineering companies that used to be software companies. There needs to be a realization of the second S in SaaS, which is the service element. You become a servicer as well as just a software engineer. And so being mindful of these business critical systems and making sure that these updates are coming at times that suit clients, and it's not just being a kind of push onto them, as you would do with perhaps some of your less business critical systems that you're using to enter expenses or your timesheets or something that are just getting small incremental upgrades in the background. These are
Yeah.
really important systems that ensure that organizations stay compliant and are operating as they should be.
So you mentioned quite an interesting point there. You're talking about the different markets and trying to build it where it's standard across different markets, or it could be different industries actually in the same market as well.
Right.
And what extent do you think that collections is just kind of the same across, and the process is the same across all of that, where it can be very standardized versus, certainly in areas like regulation is probably your area where it is actually different. Like, how do you take that into account to try and then keep that kind of standardized process in place as well? Because building it once is one thing, building it many times and having it sort of flexible across many different industries and markets is something else, right? I mean, what are the complexities with that, and how standard is it? I mean, do we make it more complex than it needs to be?
No, I don't think so. I think it's about creating the right tools to enable clients to fulfill what they need. I think if collections was collections, then one size fits all would be a very popular product, but it's just not the case. And over the decades, we've seen many organizations building pre-configured and try and sell them. And the reality is it's probably okay for most companies, but it's not right for any, and it generally
Mm.
fails. So yeah, I think from a feature function perspective, it's about creating enough of the right tools within the
Mm.
application to enable a client to then fulfill their own needs. So whether that happens to be ID and verification, whether that's ensuring that you've got scripting to make sure that you have informed the customer of whatever they need to be aware of and so on. So whatever that particular piece of regulation is. But that said, there is a huge portion that is absolutely common, right? Some organizations will look at perhaps building software and an application themselves versus going and buying one. And a collection system is made up and has many components: screens, database, remediation tools, workflow, and so on. So a lot of that is common across all territories and pretty much all sectors. It's then how that's used and
Yeah.
configured will enable you to fit that for purpose.
Yeah, I almost see it as almost like, how do you boil it down to almost like the standard building blocks to a certain extent, and then how do you then combine those in different, like, but it's right, it's getting it down to those standard building blocks is the tricky piece.
Yeah, absolutely. And you try and second guess as much as you can. So for example, screen design is really important. I am always in awe of collectors and agents that have a really complicated, difficult job interacting with these systems. They're also speaking to somebody who's potentially going through a really bad time, and they're having to listen to them. They're having to make sure that they've informed them of everything they need to inform them of. They're trying to take notes. They're trying to understand, listen out for vulnerabilities. They're trying to navigate 3, 4, 5, 10 systems at a time and so on. So they're doing an incredible job. And so trying to make it as easy as possible for them by presenting the right data for the right type of account, the right customer in the right place, and having that dashboard snapshot of 100 pieces of information, but actually presenting the elements and drawing your attention to the areas that they need to focus on at that point in time, and making, reducing number of clicks, reducing amount of typing and text that needs to happen.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, one big theme that I sort of started to see come through is almost like the build your own, right? You talk about it like it's quite easy to build these things. You sort of say, well, I might flippantly say that, which the reality is it's not. Well, why don't we just build our own, right? So sometimes you hear that, How do you feel about that? Obviously, you guys do it sort of, it's your product. I mean, what are the big pitfalls that people have got to watch out for? And I suppose versus someone like yourself in terms of buying it essentially off the shelf.
Yeah. And look, someone could be fairly skeptical thinking he's working for a software company. So I may be fairly biased, but that said, I've spent the last 2 decades advising clients as well, and not working directly in the software space. And the answer was always the same, in the sense of, the reality is that build your own can seem very attractive. You can potentially get exactly what you need as an organization. And, building enterprise level software is more accessible now. It's cheaper to do. There are more tools out there. But the reality is there's so many pitfalls that you need to be aware of. And for every one case of where it may have worked or it may have been okay, and I can only think of one example where that's the case, there are thousands of where it just doesn't. And there's various reasons for that. I mean, software vendors have spent decades and huge amounts of cash building and investing in these products. You're starting, the out of the box starting point is so much further down the line than bringing a group of people together internally to think, hey, we could try and build this ourselves, for a number of reasons. And I mentioned before about the screens and the database and ensuring that you've got the right scalability and flexibility, and the type of client that you are presenting data to agents, ensuring that you are covered from a regulatory perspective and having the tools to make sure that you're covered, the elasticity of the database, of the data model. But as much as anything, the reality is that every software vendor will also have a roadmap 2-3 years out of other stuff that they're working on. One of the things I would suggest that people ask when they are going to market is not just what's your roadmap for the last couple of years, but how have you delivered on that? I think we fall into a trap sometimes of seeing something that's forward facing and its point in time. It's good to know, what have you delivered over the last 2, 3, 4 years that you said you were going to do? And an internal build will result in, going live with a finished product. The reality is collection systems are never finished products, because there's always something else that's coming along, and you're going to be able to tap into that rich vein of innovation for years to come.
I look at it in much more sort of like simple kind of terms from my perspective. So it's almost like spreadsheets, because I like spreadsheets. And you start off with a new spreadsheet and everything's perfect, right? And it all starts out, everything's stacked up and you built it around what you actually want. But then by the time you come to the second iteration, it starts to become more complicated. You have to put workarounds in and those kind of things. It takes a lot of hard work to try and keep it standard all the way through over multiple iterations to keep it in an organized fashion. They have a tendency to go to chaos and then you basically start again. And I imagine, I don't know if that analogy works for software as well. You start off with a greenfield and everything looks great, but then you start to get this technical debt that starts to build up. You've got to be really controlled and disciplined to make sure it doesn't.
You absolutely do. Yeah. You've got a small group of people that probably know it intimately, and you're really reliant on them. Bringing anyone new in requires a huge amount of upskilling. And organizations need to be really careful about the regulatory and compliance elements. There's been breaches that we've seen, relatively recently, with very big sums and remediation numbers behind them. And the reality is you're buying an element of peace of mind. It's not guaranteed by buying something from an external party that you won't have those, but you'll at least have all of the right tools that are there and the checks and balances in place without.
Yeah.
I have definitely written a lot of spreadsheets that have got a formula error in somewhere, and one number can turn out to be a little bit incorrect. And I'm sure we're all the same. And you don't have that with something that's procured externally.
Yeah, I wake up in cold sweats about those kind of sort of things. So AI has been a hot topic, and we should chat a little bit about that. I mean, that's been the topic of the year, I think, certainly last year. What's your kind of view on where we're going with AI, where it is? I mean, it feels like it was super hot. It's maybe gone a little bit off the boil, but it's definitely there in every single conversation. I mean, what's your view on where it's taking us?
It is there in every conversation. It seems to be, perhaps in the absence of anything else or something else, it is very much the hot topic of the moment. Look, I mean, AI in itself isn't new. We know that. AI in collections, been around a little while. I recall going to an event in 2018, and the general view was we cannot have AI in collections. There was a lot of case studies at the time of various bots running with biases and so on. We couldn't possibly bring this into a collection space because we cannot have something that we cannot explain and has no transparency to make decisions and execute on those decisions.
Mm.
And I think looking back, that was probably quite a naive view from us, but that's because AI at the time seemed to be this quite sort of distant technology that we just, we couldn't really understand and we couldn't play with. Of course, we have, ChatGPT and all of these other tools, and we're becoming more familiar with it and its capabilities. So is there a place? Yes, absolutely. There's a place. I think the reason everyone's talking about it is because it is a very exciting technology. And I think it does have a place in collections, but I've got a couple of thoughts on it. And firstly, generally my view when it comes to tech is that, what's the problem you're trying to solve? And then tech comes along and tries to solve for that. But in this instance, I think you have to turn it on its head a little bit. You have to throw some things at it and understand, where could we use this? Where are some of the use cases? And I think in the reality is that no creditor, lender, software company wants to create something that has the potential to do any kind of customer harm. And we don't want to do that in collections. It's a sensitive subject. It's a difficult and complex area. And so we want to absolutely have that safety net. Unlike areas where perhaps in sales, in e-commerce, where you can try a lot of these things out and you can kind of test and learn. So we absolutely, and at Telrock, we have that as an absolute sort of red line that we will never build anything that has the potential for customer harm. But that doesn't mean to say that you can't use it and that there's no place for it. So I can kind of see two areas of use with AI. There's sort of and simplistically kind of back office, front office, right? So on the back office side, again, some of the slightly less glamorous elements, but when you talk about cloud computing and you've got, scalability of how all of that infrastructure is managing perhaps an erratic user base, you've got a lot of AI tools that are sitting there in the background, fraud detection and so on. And stuff that agents and heads of collections probably don't really see. It's much more on the kind of technical infrastructure side. And then you've got front office as well, in some areas where, users like you and I would be sitting there and interacting. And we've started looking at a number of different areas around MI, where you can use natural language processing to interact with, Power BI as opposed to just suites of reports. You can look at areas such as suggestions on changes to workflows without any kind of execution of that. And other areas where, again, supporting agents, which I think is where it will come into the slightly more glamorous side. So whether that's at a very sort of basic level, typing up wrap-up notes, Gen AI, changing those and sorting those, making sure there's no typos in there, making sure that they're searchable, all of these things that are maybe not too exciting, but you're going to be saving some human agent time, right the way then through into sentiment analysis, helping to turn bad calls into good calls, whether that's tone of voice, sort of tonality, whether that's the language that's used and suggestions and so on. So I think there's a lot of areas that we will start to investigate with AI and we'll play with some of these things before we allow it to just run wild and say, yeah, our whole collections department just fully runs on AI and we've got auto voice bots and they're having the conversation with humans and so on. While some of that is possible, I don't think anyone in the foreseeable future is going to be looking at that. But there's some interesting areas around explainable AI as well that is coming to the front now. And I think we're starting to understand the nuances of where this technology can be used. From a Telrock perspective, we don't want it to distract us and just look at AI, because different regulatory bodies will have a different view in different territories. And so I suspect where we'll see some innovation is organizations that focus on a single territory because they are able to build very specific products, meeting a requirement or a legislation, versus again, trying to be kind of all things to all people around the world.
Yeah. You're making me think they're talking about AI is kind of similar in some ways to the collections piece, which is there's a lot of value in collections, but it's also maybe the less interesting area in terms of the public perception, but actually there's a lot of complexity there, but there's also a lot of value in there. And I just wonder if, as you're talking about AI there, it's actually maybe some of the less exciting areas where there's probably a lot of value in terms of actually putting some of this automation in instead of just looking at this agent AI as an example, which might be the exciting place, that there's actually a lot of value elsewhere as well. Maybe that's a good place for us to start looking when it's because it's got lower risk.
Absolutely. And, looking at RPA, which is not AI, has a very useful function in terms of some of the mundane activity with an AI layer over and above that. One of the issues with RPA is you need a very stable technology environment for it to operate, because it does the same things repetitively. And when that changes, it can cause some difficulties. But with layers of AI over that, it could help manage and sort of swerve its way around the issues there. So yeah, I think where we will see some early wins is around some of the less exciting areas, but at the same time, we should be open to bring in new technology. You know, as I say, collections was always a follower rather than a leader, but I think that lag time is getting shorter.
Yeah, I mean, and where are you seeing, I suppose, in terms of like the investment landscape? I mean, is the same sort of money to invest as there was? And because it does feel like, I mean, we were kind of waiting for the delinquency rates to go up during COVID. I mean, fortunately they didn't, right, as well. But
Right.
it's sort of that has a constraint in terms of, you know, without a burning platform, then often that, people will put the money elsewhere because they're trying to grow the business, which kind of makes sense. I mean, so how are you sort of perceiving that investment landscape in terms of people putting new systems in or thinking about new capability? I mean, what are you seeing?
Yeah, I think we're seeing that open up over the last 6 months. There's no question that during COVID, funds were diverted and attention was diverted, right? I mean, clients were experiencing anything from 4 to 10 times call volume. Agents were having to be routed to work from home, and there was a lot of other AT-led projects and programs that needed to get stood up pretty quickly. And so any large enterprise new collection system projects, if they were in flight, generally were tending to continue. And if they were pre-contract, generally they were put on pause for a while. And then, of course, straight off the back of inflationary rises pretty much around the world, other geopolitical issues and so on, interest rate rises caused it to get pushed back again a little bit. But I think coming out of that now, that sort of 18-24 month delay from 2020, 2021 through to 2023, I think we're starting to see that open up again. And we're certainly getting a lot of interest from some large organizations around the world.
And what's your kind of view on the economy? And I talk about the global economy as much as anything, which is, I mean, because we were always expecting things to potentially go through a downturn. It sort of has, but we haven't necessarily seen it in arrears levels. Do you think the fact that companies are investing is sort of like there's a bit of sort of precautionary kind of investing because they think, well, maybe we're not necessarily out of the woods yet?
I think that's absolutely the case. Yeah. And I think everyone is aware that there is just more and more regulatory pressures coming as well. And that landscape is growing again around the world. So yeah, I think we're far from being out of the woods. There's also a number of other events that we know that are happening, so domestically in the UK, we've got the budget from new government. We don't know exactly what to expect from or what we're going to see from that. We've obviously got an election in the US. We've got various wars going on around the world. And I think as we're all realizing more and more that we're such an interconnected world and that what's happening over there definitely has an impact on what's happening in, here. So I think there is a case of ensuring that you've got the right tech in place, that you're able to navigate those regulatory complexities and that you are prepared for what is coming potentially. We probably all thought was going to happen from COVID. You also get the sense that some of that was delayed. And so, yeah, I mean, organizations are investing, we see a number of conversations taking place and that's all around the world from large organizations wanting to invest in this space.
I mean, the one thing I definitely took away from the pandemic was just being ready and being prepared, right? I mean, so people, we could have been much better prepared for it. And I think that's probably true for everyone, right? Everywhere. And you think that some of these things may be unlikely to happen, or you think you're sort of in a stable status quo and then something happens and throws you completely off track. And all of the changes that came through in terms of like different forbearance plans or just like programming all that stuff in just was extra complexity, right? So if you're ready for it and you invest and you're prepared for it, it feels like you're in a much better spot. So that's around getting ahead of things rather than being on the back foot.
Yeah, being as prepared as you can be, not knowing what's coming next. But yeah, absolutely, having those right tools in place, you're going to be better prepared than not.
Yeah, yeah. So I remember thinking we're like being a Cub Scout there, being prepared, but so really good. I mean, where do you think we're going to be in sort of like 5 years' time or even 3 years' time? I mean, we talked a bit about where we've come from, and we've come an awfully long way very, very quickly. It feels like the pace of change keeps on accelerating. It really does. I mean, where do you think we'll be in sort of like 3 to 5 years' time? What's get your crystal ball out, I suppose, or your prediction hat on?
You know, well, look, I think there's a couple of things, right, that spring to mind. And again, talk about cloud technology. I think it's full adoption of the cloud and growth in the cloud and really being able to harness that. And, I mean, this stuff doesn't happen overnight. So 3 to 5 years will come along very quickly. So I think what we're seeing is much more investment in cloud technology, much more investment in the other tools and innovations that we can utilize in that space. Clearly, AI is going to be, on the in the talking shop for the foreseeable. I think starting to build some of those use cases out and really starting to see that being integrated within the collections area. Um, and then, there's a whole bunch of other technologies that we haven't spoken about, such as blockchain and so on, that again, we're on that hype cycle and perhaps, not maybe how is that relevant to collections? And I think, again, struggling to see what the benefits case, what the use case is there and why we'd be, diverting our attention into that space. So look, I think there's going to be a bit of a divergence of organizations. So I think for the first time ever, as speed of change increases, anyone that's getting left behind really is kind of quite left behind now. But when I go back to starting in my career, it's only 25 years ago, you could be a bit late to the party. It was a less crowded marketplace and you had catch up time, right? And now it feels like you kind of don't. I think we probably won't see as many really big, innovative technologies that are coming out of left field that we don't know about now over the next 3 to 5 years. It's not a long period, but certainly proper full adoption of the cloud landscape. Certainly some more AI use cases being much more everyday.
Well, you're making me think. I just go back to the early days of the internet back in the year 2000 or the World Wide Web as it was then, I
Yes.
suppose, and how back then we all thought it was going to be pre-dot-com bust. Everything was going to be digital. Everything was going to be online. We were going to have videos online and it really didn't happen. But we are like that today. Everything I've just said, we're like that today, but we're like that today in 2024. We weren't like that in 2020. It wasn't until really after the crash in 2008 that really things started to sort of really pick up, I would say. But now it's ubiquitous, but it takes time for these things to come through. So even things like blockchain, there's a big hype, but probably need to keep our eye on it just in case there's something happens in the future, those kind of things.
Yeah, I agree. I think probably the final area, I would say something that new, but in terms of a digital first approach, self-serve, giving consumers the tools that they need and being able to do that seamlessly as messaging tools and techniques evolve and adopt. And we just sort of, we're able to take advantage of them. I think we're seeing a lot of organizations that push a digital first agenda, reduce the agent need down significantly. But digital first doesn't obviously mean digital only, right? And so it's trying to, again, harmoniously incorporate the channels that a consumer might want and the experience that a consumer might want, along with doing the right thing and making someone available for what could be a very complicated conversation. So I think better integration over the next 3 to 5 years of good quality digital comms.
Yeah, and I suppose as you're saying, some of those basic fundamentals around good customer treatment and solving problems, that stuff doesn't go away because all businesses are human to us and they have human customers to a certain extent.
Right.
So, well, Andy, thanks very much for making the time. It's great to chat to you and sort of pick your brains on, all the things that are happening from a technology point of view and sort of and what's going on with you guys there. It's super interesting. It's an exciting time, right? I really do think
It
so.
really is.
Yeah. So thanks very much. Really appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Chris. Great chatting to you.